My son's teacher has been giving him some strange homework. His latest assignment was horrifying. It has been 4 days since Dylan disappeared and there is still no sign of him or the class. After posting my previous story, I received a lot of messages of people who were concerned about the whole situation. Most messages were just wishing me luck in finding Dylan, but there was one message that stood out. A message from a mayor of a small town that is not far from where I live. I have changed the name of the town. It appears that Dylan and his class, along with Mrs. Wagner, have passed through the town, and so this person has sent me the story as to what transpired in his town. The story is as follows. The school bus arrived in our small town at just gone 10:30 in the morning. It was loaded with a bunch of children, around the age of 9 or 10. The driver of the bus was a younger woman, probably around the age of 30, who had long, black hair and dark-colored eyes. The bus was your standard, yellow school bus that was probably only about half full of students. I think when I quickly counted them, there were probably around 23 children inside of the bus. The bus stopped outside of the town hall, which is where I spend most of my time. As town mayor, the town hall is pretty much my home, and my actual house is more like my holiday home. I was sitting at my desk when the bus arrived, and I saw it pull up through my large window that looks out onto the street. I thought it was strange that a busload of kids would arrive here, as this is only a small town of only around 5,000 people, so it was odd that a school bus would come to visit. I decided to head out of my office and go out and greet the newly arrived guests. I thought that maybe it would make their trip a bit more special if they were greeted by the mayor of the town. Hello, and welcome to the town of Frayton. I called out to the children and the woman standing with them. We are honored to have you here. The woman who was with the group, who I had assumed was their teacher, walked over to me and put out her hand to shake mine. I took her hand, shook it, and I introduced myself. She then replied that it was nice to meet me, and she told me that her name was Mrs. Wagner. She then turned around to the class and said, "Okay class, would you all say good morning to the mayor of this town?" "Good morning, mayor," all of the students responded in a monotone manner, in perfect unison. All of the students were standing in a perfectly straight line, all staring towards me. Their eyes seemed a little strange, almost like they were emotionless, or maybe even lifeless. I was a bit taken aback by how they were all looking at me and the way that they spoke, in monotone voices and at the exact same time. I first thought that maybe they were taught how to respond in the same way at the same time, but even then, I thought that that was a weird thing to teach children. "Can anyone tell me why you are here today, visiting the lovely town of Frayton?" I asked the class, trying to see if the students would respond in a different manner than before. There was silence for a few moments before a young girl, near the end of the line, raised her hand, and when I acknowledged her raised hand she said, "Mrs. Wagner is taking us to meet our new parents." She spoke once again in a monotone voice and almost like she was reading from a script. I didn't know how to react to this, but just after the little girl had finished speaking, Mrs. Wagner quickly let out a short laugh and said, "What she means is, we are going on a camp to a small retreat, and I have told them that while we are there, the owners of the retreat will be like their parents. They will need to listen to them and do what they say and follow all of their instructions. Isn't that right, class?" "Yes, Mrs. Wagner," all the students responded, once again in perfect unison. I was very confused at this point but tried my best to keep smiling and making the class feel welcome. I told them all to enjoy their time in our small town and that I hoped they had a wonderful stay at their camp. Mrs. Wagner thanked me for my time and for greeting them, before I left, and the class went about their business. Mrs. Wagner and her class ended up staying in Frayton for about 2 hours. I'm not exactly sure what they did in those 2 hours, as I was too busy working, but when they all came back to the bus, all of the children were dressed differently. They were now all dressed in a fairly olden day clothes. The girls were in plain dresses and the boys were in robes. Both the dresses and robes were a light blue color, and on their heads, they were wearing a small, pointed hat. This was very strange. I had never seen a group of children dressed this way before. I didn't really know what to think. Maybe this had something to do with the camp? Or maybe the kids were forced to dress this way? I don't really know. I'll be honest, I didn't really think about the class and Mrs. Wagner after they had boarded the bus and driven out of town. I had been distracted by a large amount of work that had been piling up throughout the day, so I was too busy to even give them a second thought. It wasn't until 2 days later, when they returned to the town, that I once again gave them any more attention. The school bus arrived late at night. I was still in my office after a long day, when I heard the sound of a bus braking from outside of the town hall. I looked up at the clock on my wall and it read 10:37. This was too late for a bus to be arriving in the town, and so I went over to the window and pulled back the closed curtains to look outside the window. I saw the same school bus that had been here a few days ago, parked out the front of the town hall, once again. I saw that it was still full of children and I recognized the driver, Mrs. Wagner. I was a bit concerned as to what they were doing back in Frayton so late at night. So, I left my office and walked down the main corridor of the town hall and outside to see what they were doing here. Once I got outside, however, I saw that the entire bus was deserted and there was no one to be seen. It had only been 3 minutes or so since I left my office until I got outside, so they must have gotten off of the bus and dispersed quite quickly. I had a quick look around to see if I could see anyone, but there was no one in the vicinity to be seen. I thought maybe they had all gone to the small motel that is down the road. It was the only place in this town that provides accommodation, so I guess that is probably where they had gone to. They had just gone there in a bit of a rush. I was still concerned at this point and still wanted to find them, so I decided that I would head down to the motel and see if they were there. I started the 5-minute walk down to the hotel. I turned off of the street that the town hall is located on and walked past a few houses before turning down the next street, the street that the motel is on. As I turned down the street, I saw the group of kids, all standing in a circle, standing around something. The teacher, Mrs. Wagner, was nowhere to be seen. I quickly walked over to them, to see what they were standing around, and that's when I saw her. Mrs. Wagner. She was lying on the ground, covered in blood, a knife laying down next to her. I think she was still alive, and the students were all just staring at her. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to help her. I pushed past the kids in the circle and bent down to help the woman on the ground. What happened to her? I called out to the children standing in the circle. I needed to know what had happened. No one was responding at first, but as I was pulling out my phone to call the ambulance, one of the kids spoke. "She is a gift for our new parents," the same girl that responded to me before replied. I didn't know what that meant, and I was about to ask more questions when I felt a sharp pain in the side of my neck. I quickly turned to see what had caused it, and I saw a needle poking out, one of the kids still holding the other end of it. Everything started to go dark and fuzzy, and the last thing I remember was one of the kids walking over to me and forcing my eyes closed. I was found about 4 hours later, by on the residents of the town, walking home from the pub. They managed to wake me and, even though they were a bit drunk, managed to get me to the police station that was down the road. I have told the police everything that I experienced, and they have told me that they will do their best to find out what has happened to these kids and what happened to their teacher. The school bus was still parked out the front of the town hall, but all of the kids have disappeared. One witness, Mrs. Gilleen, happened to look out of her window at around midnight after hearing a group of people walking nearby, and she said that she saw a group of young children walking down the main road that leads out of town. She says that she saw a very large figure walking at the front and the children all walking behind this figure in a perfectly straight line. She claims the figure was holding the body of a woman, and she described the figure as a silhouette that almost didn't look human. That is the only information that I can provide at the moment, but I will post any updates if I learn any more about this increasingly disturbing situation.